The night of September 6, 1776, did not merely fall upon New York Harbor. It pressed down with a humid, suffocating weight. The water temperature, still retaining the warmth of late summer, belied the treacherous hydrodynamic forces at play beneath the surface. The harbor, a complex estuary where the Hudson River, then known as the North River, met the East River, was a cauldron of tidal currents. On this particular night, the tide was running with ferocious strength, a factor that would dictate the operational parameters of the mission more than any human intent. For the Continental Army, the strategic situation was dire. General George Washington's forces were pinned on Manhattan, facing the overwhelming might of the British Expeditionary Force. Dominating the harbor was a Royal Navy armada comprising hundreds of transport ships and warships, a floating city of oak and iron that strangled the American supply lines. At the heart of this fleet, anchored off Staten Island, lay the HMS Eagle, a 64-gun third-rate ship of the line, the flagship of Admiral Richard Howe. Amidst this display of imperial power, a microscopic anomaly bobbed in the chop near Whitehall Stairs at the tip of Manhattan. It was the turtle. To the uninitiated observer, it might have looked like a wayward buoy or a piece of flotsam. In reality, it was the most sophisticated piece of engineering in the Western Hemisphere, a vessel designed to contravene the established laws of naval warfare. Inside this oak-hulled sphere sat Sergeant Ezra Lee, a volunteer from the 10th Continental Regiment, who was about to embark on a mission that required him to do what no human had ever done in combat: breathe, navigate, and kill from beneath the waves. The interior of the turtle was a testament to the prioritization of function over form. The vessel stood approximately 6 to 7 feet high and about 7 feet long, shaped like two tortoise shells joined vertically. For Lee, a man of average stature, the cockpit was a masterclass in ergonomics designed for a singular purpose. He sat on a small beam, his body integrating with the machine's controls in a way that presaged the pilot-vehicle interfaces of the 20th century. The sensory environment was overwhelming. The air was heavy with the scent of tar, which coated every inch of the oak hull to waterproof it, mixed with the metallic tang of the brass gears and the organic musk of the foxfire used for illumination. The acoustic signature of the vessel was equally distinct. The creaking of the timber under pressure, the gurgle of water in the ballast pumps, and the rhythmic grinding of the hand-cranked propeller shafts created a cacophony that Lee had to mentally filter to focus on his objective. There was no ambient light. The hatch, a heavy copper or brass casting, sealed him off from the starlight. His only visual references were the bioluminescent gauges glowing with a ghostly green-blue hue, fungal light sources, derived from decaying wood, specifically chosen for their ability to emit light without consuming the vessel's precious oxygen supply. The turtle was not a passive vessel. It was human-powered. Lee was the engine. The propulsion system relied on two Archimedes screws, precursors to the modern propeller. A large horizontal screw at the front pulled the vessel forward and backward, operated by a crank and treadle system that required constant, rhythmic exertion. A smaller vertical screw on top allowed the vessel to ascend and descend, demanding that Lee remove a hand from the forward crank to adjust his depth. Simultaneously, he had to manage his buoyancy. At his feet were brass valves controlling the intake of water into the bilge tanks. To surface, he had to manually pump this water out using forcing pumps manufactured by the clockmaker Isaac Doolittle. The physical demand was immense. Lee was essentially rowing a 1-ton wooden box against a tidal current that could reach 3 to 4 knots, all while monitoring his depth, checking his compass, and regulating his breathing to conserve the 30 minutes of air contained within the hull. At approximately 11 p.m., the operation commenced. Whaleboats, manned by silent crews, towed the turtle out from the battery, moving effectively into the channel to give Lee a fighting chance against the tide. The tow line was cast off. The whaleboats vanished into the darkness, retreating to the safety of the shore. Ezra Lee was now the loneliest man in America. He began to crank. The resistance of the water against the oak blades of the propeller was immediate. The turtle responded sluggishly, its hydrodynamic drag significant. Lee realized almost immediately that the tide was stronger than anticipated. It was an ebb tide, sweeping south toward the open ocean, threatening to carry him past the British fleet entirely. To counteract this, Lee had to pedal with frantic intensity. He was not merely navigating, he was fighting a kinetic battle against the Atlantic Ocean. He surfaced frequently, cracking the hatch to gulp fresh air and verify his position. The lights of the British fleet flickered in the distance, a constellation of death that seemed to move laterally across his viewport as the current dragged him sideways. "I was obliged to rise up every few minutes to see that I sailed in the right direction," Lee later wrote to David Humphreys, describing a very crooked and zigzag course. For 2.5 hours, Ezra Lee battled the current. His progress was agonizingly slow. The physical exertion raised the temperature inside the turtle, causing condensation to bead on the cold oak walls. The carbon dioxide levels began to creep upward, a silent toxin that induces panic and confusion. Dangerous companions for a man piloting an experimental submersible. Navigating by the foxfire compass was an exercise in intuition. The bioluminescent wood, glowing on the needle, was dim and fluctuated with the ambient temperature, though in the warmth of September it likely held its luminescence. However, the erratic motion of the turtle, pitching and yawing in the harbor chop, made the compass needle swing wildly. Lee had to average the readings mentally, correcting his course while his legs burned with lactic acid. By approximately 1:30 or 2 a.m., the tide turned. The flood tide began to push north, aiding Lee's approach but introducing a new peril: the risk of being smashed against the hulls he intended to destroy. The silhouette of the HMS Eagle loomed out of the darkness, a massive cliff of wood rising 20 feet above the waterline. Lee maneuvered the turtle into the flagship's shadow. The Eagle was silent, save for the creak of rigging and the footsteps of the watch on deck. Lee was now directly beneath the stern of the 64-gun ship. The scale of the target was intimidating. The rudder alone was massive, a slab of oak reinforced with iron bands. He prepared to submerge. He opened the foot valve, and the sound of water rushing into the bilges filled the small cabin. The waterline rose up the viewports until the black water swallowed him completely. He was now submerged, drifting in the blind spot of the Royal Navy. The weapon system of the turtle was a detached mine, or torpedo, tethered to the back of the submarine. It contained 150 pounds of black powder and a clockwork detonator. To deliver this payload, Lee had to use a vertical auger, a sharp, screw-threaded drill bit that extended through the top of the conning tower. The procedure was mechanically complex. Position the turtle directly under the enemy hull. Use the vertical propeller to push the turtle upward, creating positive pressure against the ship's bottom to stabilize the craft. Rotate the auger handle to bore the bit into the enemy's hull planks. Once the bit was secure, release the mine, which was attached to the bit by a rope. The release of the mine would automatically start the clockwork timer. The turtle would retreat, and 20 minutes later, the mine would detonate. Lee found his position near the Eagle's rudder. He cranked the vertical propeller, feeling the turtle rise until it thumped gently against the ship's bottom. He reached up, grasped the handle of the auger, and began to turn. He expected the resistance of wood, the bite of the iron bit into oak. Instead, he met an impenetrable hardness. The drill spun, scratched, and skittered, but it would not bite. Lee pushed harder, using the buoyancy of the sub to drive the drill upward, but the result was the same. The bit struck metal. Historians and Bushnell himself debated the cause. Some argued the Eagle was copper-sheathed, a practice used to protect ships from teredo worms. Others, including Bushnell, believed Lee had struck the heavy iron bar that secured the rudder hinge. Regardless of the metallic composition, the physics were undeniable. A hand-cranked drill operated by an exhausted man in a bobbing cork could not penetrate iron plate. Lee attempted to reposition. He let water into the tanks to sink slightly, drifting a few feet to try a new spot. But the moment he lost contact with the hull, the hydrodynamics turned against him. The turtle was not neutrally buoyant enough to hover perfectly. Without the friction of the hull to hold it in place, the strong current caught the vessel. He was swept sideways. The window of opportunity was closing. He tried to paddle back, but the turtle was sluggish. The air was growing foul. He was disoriented, tired, and drifting out from under the Eagle. As he struggled to regain control, the buoyancy of the craft, perhaps lighter than he intended due to the expended effort, caused him to breach the surface. He broke water just yards from the Eagle. The sun was beginning to streak the eastern sky. The cover of darkness was evaporating. Ezra Lee was floating in a wooden barrel in the middle of the British fleet. The mission failed, his presence exposed. To understand the machine struggling in the morning light of 1776, one must examine the mind that conceived it. David Bushnell was an anomaly in the agrarian society of colonial Connecticut. Born in 1740 in Saybrook, now Westbrook, he was a farmer's son who did not follow the furrow. He remained on the family farm until his father's death, but his mind was elsewhere. At the relatively advanced age of 31, he sold his inheritance, his half of the farm, to his brother Ezra and enrolled at Yale College in 1771. Yale in the early 1770s was a hotbed of both revolutionary fervor and scientific inquiry. The curriculum included natural philosophy, mathematics, and the study of the physical world. Bushnell was described by contemporaries as reticent, distant, and exceedingly private, traits often associated with obsessive genius. While his classmates debated Locke and Rousseau, Bushnell was contemplating the physics of combustion. The military dogma of the 18th century was clear. Gunpowder was useless underwater. It was believed that water would either extinguish the fuse or dissipate the explosive force so rapidly that it would cause no damage. Bushnell, possessing a rigorous scientific mind, questioned this assumption. He began a series of experiments during his time at Yale that would have terrified the faculty had they known the extent of them. He proved that if gunpowder were hermetically sealed in a container, it could be detonated. More importantly, he discovered a crucial principle of fluid dynamics. Water is incompressible. When an explosion occurs in air, the force dissipates rapidly in all directions. Underwater, the surrounding water acts as a tamp, a massive, unyielding wall that contains the energy. If an explosion occurs against a ship's hull, the water refuses to move, forcing the blast energy into the air-filled void of the ship, the path of least resistance. Bushnell demonstrated this by detonating 2 ounces of powder underwater and later 2 pounds, proving that a relatively small charge could shatter a massive oak timber. Having proven the weapon, the mine, Bushnell needed a delivery system. A floating mine was subject to the whims of the tide. A surface boat would be seen and destroyed by the ship's watch. The only logical solution was a vessel that could approach invisibly, a submarine. This was a leap of imagination that bypassed centuries of naval tradition. Leonardo da Vinci had sketched diving suits, and William Bourne had theorized about variable volume vessels in 1578, but no one had built a functional military submarine. Bushnell had to invent every system from scratch. He needed a hull that could withstand pressure, a way to sink and rise at will, a method of propulsion independent of the wind, and a life support system for the pilot. Bushnell was the architect, but he was not a craftsman. He returned to Saybrook and enlisted the help of his brother, Ezra Bushnell, and a network of skilled artisans. Crucial among them was Isaac Doolittle, a clockmaker and bell founder from New Haven. Doolittle was a patriot and a mechanical wizard. He was tasked with creating the most delicate components of the machine, the brass forcing pumps for the ballast system and, critically, the clockwork detonator for the mine. This timer had to run silently, reliably, and trigger a flintlock mechanism to spark the powder after a precise delay, technology that was cutting edge for the era. Construction began in 1775 on Poverty Island in the Connecticut River. a secluded location chosen to maintain absolute secrecy. The vessel that emerged was a marvel of material engineering. The hull was constructed of oak timbers, shaped like the staves of a barrel but curved to form two shells. These were joined at a central flange and reinforced with iron bands to resist the hydrostatic pressure of depth. The entire exterior was heavily tarred to ensure a watertight seal. Bushnell devised the first practical variable ballast system. A valve at the operator's foot admitted water into the bottom of the vessel, the bilge, to reduce buoyancy and sink. To surface, the operator worked two brass pumps to force the water out against the pressure of the deep. As a failsafe, the Turtle carried 900 pounds of lead ballast on its keel. 200 pounds of this could be mechanically detached from the inside, causing the sub to rocket to the surface in an emergency. The screws were Bushnell's most forward-looking innovation. While he described them as oars, based on the principle of the screw, they were effectively the first marine propellers. The front propeller, for horizontal movement, was about 12 inches long with two blades. The vertical propeller assisted with depth control. The interior of the Turtle was pitch black when the hatch was closed. Using a candle was impossible. It would consume the oxygen intended for the pilot. Bushnell needed a cold light source to illuminate the compass and the depth gauge, a barometer tube. He turned to nature. He collected foxfire, rotting wood infected with bioluminescent fungi such as Pinellus stypticus. The decaying wood emitted a faint green glow. He affixed chips of this wood to the compass needle and the cork float of the depth gauge. However, this biological solution revealed the fragility of the system. In late 1775, during initial tests, the foxfire failed. The light extinguished. Bushnell discovered that the fungus was temperature sensitive. As the water in the Connecticut River cooled with the approaching winter, the metabolic rate of the fungus slowed, and the light died. This cold failure forced Bushnell to suspend operations until the following summer, a delay that prevented the Turtle from attacking the British in Boston. The original pilot was Ezra Bushnell. He had trained for months, mastering the idiosyncrasies of the cranky, unstable vessel. He knew how to balance the pumps against the screws. But in the summer of 1776, as the operation moved to New York, Ezra fell violently ill, likely with typhoid or a severe fever. David Bushnell, physically frail and exhausted by the design process, could not pilot the craft himself. The mission was in jeopardy. General Samuel Parsons recruited 3 volunteers from the Army. The best among them was Sergeant Ezra Lee of Old Lyme. Lee was strong, literate, and possessed a steady nerve. But he had only a few weeks to learn what Ezra Bushnell had practiced for months. He trained in the waters of the Long Island Sound, learning to pilot the water machine just as the British noose tightened around New York. To understand the audacity of the Turtle mission, one must appreciate the scale of the adversary. The British fleet in New York Harbor in 1776 was the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century. It included 30 ships of the line, hundreds of frigates and transports, and over 30,000 troops. The HMS Eagle was a third-rate ship of the line. She carried 64 guns on 2 decks. Her crew numbered over 500 men. She was sheathed in copper below the waterline, a technological innovation the British had introduced to prevent fouling and rot. This copper sheathing rendered the hull smooth and hard, significantly harder than the bare oak Lee might have expected. New York was the hinge of the colonies. If the British controlled it, they could sever New England from the rest of the colonies. Washington's army was outnumbered and outgunned. They had no navy to speak of. The Continental Navy consisted of converted merchantmen and a few frigates, utterly incapable of challenging the British line of battle. In this context, the Turtle was not just a weapon. It was an act of desperation. It represented asymmetric warfare before the term existed. Washington himself was skeptical. He viewed the machine as a curiosity, an effort of genius, but he doubted it could alter the war. Yet he provided the funds because he had no other option to challenge British naval supremacy. Moving the Turtle from the Connecticut River to New York was a clandestine operation. It was too slow to sail and too fragile to tow in rough seas. It was transported overland by wagon from the Connecticut River to the Sound, then loaded onto a sloop. It moved by night, covered in canvas, passing through the Sound to New Rochelle, and then overland again to the Hudson River, to avoid the British patrols at the eastern end of Long Island. By early September, it was secreted at the battery, ready for the tide. The plan was simple: strike the flagship. Sinking the Eagle would not win the war, but it would shatter the psychological invincibility of the Royal Navy. It would prove that no ship was safe, even in a guarded harbor. Ezra Lee surfaced into a gray, misty dawn. The fresh air rushed into the cabin, clearing the fog of carbon dioxide from his brain, but the visual reality was terrifying. He was drifting past Governor's Island, well within sight of the British fortifications and the fleet. The strange, bobbing object caught the eye of the British sentries. "The enemy's attention was drawn towards me," Lee recalled. A 12-oared barge pushed off from Governor's Island, filled with soldiers. They rowed hard, the oars flashing in the morning light, intent on capturing or destroying the anomaly. Lee was defenseless. The Turtle had no cannon, no musket ports. His speed was negligible compared to a manned barge. He was trapped. In a moment of cold calculation, Lee decided to use his only asset, the mine. He reached back and pulled the release lever. The 150-pound keg of gunpowder, still buoyant, detached from the Turtle and bobbed in the water. The clockwork timer began its silent countdown. Lee hoped that the barge would stop to investigate the mine, or perhaps he intended to blow himself and his captors to Kingdom Come if they got too close. The British sailors, seeing the strange object detach from the submarine, hesitated. The infernal machine looked suspicious. Their caution saved Lee. The barge slowed and then turned back toward the island, perhaps fearing a trap or simply confused by the bizarre encounter. Lee used the reprieve to crank the pedals with the last of his strength, moving the Turtle toward the American lines. 20 minutes later, the timer tripped the flintlock. The explosion was cataclysmic. A massive column of water and debris shot into the air, shattering the morning silence. The sound rolled across the harbor like a thunderclap. The mine had drifted into the East River, missing the ships, but the sheer power of the blast stunned the British fleet. Captains cut their anchor cables in panic, ships drifted in confusion, and the entire harbor went to general quarters. The Eagle was safe, but the Royal Navy was terrified. They had been attacked by an invisible enemy. Lee was recovered by American boats, exhausted but a hero among the few who knew the secret. The Turtle was prepared for subsequent missions. Bushnell and Lee attempted to attack a frigate in the Hudson River later that year, but Lee was spotted by the watch and forced to dive before attaching the mine. The operational life of the Turtle ended ignominiously. As the British advanced up Manhattan and into New Jersey, the sloop transporting the submarine was sunk by British fire near Fort Lee in October 1776. The world's first combat submarine sank to the bottom of the Hudson, not in a blaze of glory but as collateral damage in a retreat. Bushnell claimed to have recovered it, but it never saw action again. Bushnell's war was not over. In 1777, he deployed floating contact mines in the Delaware River near Philadelphia. These kegs caused panic among the British, who fired on every floating log and barrel for days. This incident was immortalized in Francis Hopkinson's satirical song, The Battle of the Kegs, mocking the British fear of Bushnell's invention. From morn till night, these men of might displayed amazing courage, and when the sun was fairly down, retired to sup their porridge. Following the war, David Bushnell, the man Washington called a genius, vanished from the public eye. He served as a captain in the Corps of Sappers and Miners at Yorktown, proving his worth as a combat engineer. But in the peace that followed, he felt unappreciated and perhaps financially ruined. He moved to Georgia in 1795, severed ties with his Connecticut past, and adopted the name David Bush. He lived for 30 years in Warrenton, Georgia, serving as a beloved schoolteacher and town physician. He was a close friend of Abraham Baldwin, a signer of the Constitution and fellow Yale graduate, who likely knew his secret. It was only upon his death in 1826 that his will revealed the truth. He left his estate to the children of his brother Ezra, the man who was meant to pilot the turtle. Among his effects, his executor George Hargraves found curious machinery and models of torpedoes, the final silent testament to a mind that had tried to change the world from beneath the waves. The turtle mission is often classified as a failure because the Eagle did not sink. This assessment is superficial. Bushnell proved that. Humans could survive and navigate submerged. Gunpowder could destroy ships from below. A vessel could control its depth mechanically. These three pillars form the basis of all submarine warfare. Ezra Lee's exhausting, terrifying night in New York Harbor was not a defeat. It was the birth of a new era. The turtle was the seed. The nuclear submarines of today are the forest that grew from it.